The garden of Greystone Manor was, to the casual eye, perfection itself. Nestled in the gentle rolling hills of the Cotswolds, the estate's sprawling lawns and rose-draped trellises had, for years, drawn admiration from villagers and visitors alike. In summer, the garden became the pride of the county, with its prize-winning dahlias, its stately box hedges, and a pergola heavy with wisteria that, in May, cascaded in fragrant purple clouds. Yet, as with so many things in life, beauty concealed a darker truth, and in the heart of this Eden, where laughter and champagne were to flow on a warm June afternoon, death would come quietly, disturbingly, and altogether unnaturally. Miss Jane Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead, had never cared for grandeur for its own sake. She had been invited to Greystone by her old friend, Mrs. Sylvia Harcourt, a widowed cousin by marriage of sorts, who had insisted she must see the famed gardens and take a little rest after a spell of church committee obligations. Miss Marple had agreed, not without curiosity, for she always found large houses and their occupants to be most instructive. You may observe human nature anywhere, Jane, Sylvia had told her with a laugh over tea, but here you shall find it set against the loveliest rose bushes in the county. Greystone Manor was now under the ownership of Sir Lawrence Fenton and his much younger wife, Lady Amelia. He was a retired colonel of distinguished bearing, a man with firm opinions on nearly everything: politics, roses, and the way pheasant ought to be roasted. Lady Amelia, delicate and refined, was known for her patronage of local charities and her graceful manner at village fêtes. Yet rumours often circulated, so village tongues wagged, that their marriage was not without strain. The Harcourts and the Fentons had long been neighbours, their lands adjoining, their lives occasionally intersecting in church pews, committee meetings, and the annual summer garden party. And it was precisely for this garden party, a highlight of the season, that Miss Marple had arrived. The guest list was small but choice. Alongside the Fentons themselves, there was Mr. Geoffrey Miles, the village solicitor, whose lean frame and sharp nose gave him the look of a predatory bird. He was known to keep a careful eye on everyone's affairs, both legal and otherwise. Then there was Dr. Harold Latham, the local physician, genial yet observant, with a manner that soothed the nervous and inspired trust. A lady of rather striking appearance, Miss Charlotte Denham, completed the circle of close attendees. She was Lady Amelia's cousin from London, visiting for the summer, with a penchant for bold hats and bolder opinions. Finally, there was Mr. Edward Grant, a wealthy industrialist from Birmingham, recently retired, who had purchased the neighbouring estate. He was a man of substantial girth, a booming laugh, and an undeniable fondness for displaying his success. Miss Marple, in her sensible hat and pale summer gloves, observed them all from her wicker chair beneath the wisteria. She had already formed impressions, never judgments, for those came later, after due consideration. The Colonel's firmness of tone did not entirely disguise the irritability of advancing age. Lady Amelia's sweetness had a fragile quality, as if it were performed for effect. Miss Denham's vivacity struck her as just a trifle too sharp, the gaiety of a woman who delighted in unsettling others, and Edward Grant's joviality contained a self-satisfaction that made him, in Miss Marple's quiet opinion, a trifle careless of others' feelings. The afternoon unfolded as garden parties will. Polite conversation over cucumber sandwiches, the occasional ripple of laughter, and much admiration for the roses. Sir Lawrence took particular pride in leading his guests down the gravel paths, pointing out this specimen and that, each more splendid than the last dot. It was while admiring a particularly fine cluster of crimson blooms that the first shadow fell upon the day. Lady Amelia, pale beneath her straw hat, excused herself with a faint smile, pressing a hand to her temple. "Just the heat, I expect," she murmured, though her voice carried a slight tremor. Dr. Latham at once offered his professional concern, but she waved it away, retiring to a shaded bench near the fountain. Miss Marple, whose eyes missed very little, noticed the way Charlotte Denham followed her cousin's retreat with an expression curiously hard to define, something between pity and disdain. Later, as trays of lemonade and wine were passed, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Mr. Miles. He spoke in his dry, clipped way about the changing nature of property law, but it was his casual remark, "One wonders sometimes if the Fenton estate will remain intact much longer," that pricked her attention. He did not elaborate, for Sir Lawrence himself joined them, but Miss Marple tucked the comment away in her mind, as she might tuck a pressed flower into her gardening notebook. The garden shone. In late afternoon splendour, when calamity struck, Sir Lawrence had just proposed a toast beneath the pergola, when a sharp, startled cry echoed across the lawn. All heads turned. There, by the fountain where Lady Amelia had been resting, a small cluster of guests and servants had gathered in alarm. Miss Marple rose swiftly, though without haste, her knitting slipping unnoticed from her lap. The sight that met her eyes was at once dreadful and uncanny. Lady Amelia lay upon the grass, her hat fallen, her face ashen, her body quite still. Dr. Latham bent over her, his stethoscope already in hand, his expression grave. "She is gone," he pronounced after a long moment, rising slowly. "I fear Lady Amelia is dead." A collective gasp swept the company. Sir Lawrence's face blanched, his soldierly posture sagging. Miss Denham gave a little scream, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Mr. Grant muttered something about the shock of it, while Mr. Miles merely raised his brows, his eyes sharp with interest. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the group, felt a chill pass through her. She had seen death before, in many gusts, yet seldom in such a setting beneath roses and wisteria, with laughter so recently in the air. And something, in the manner of Lady Amelia's passing, struck her as deeply wrong. Dr. Latham, his professional instinct already in motion, suggested that Lady Amelia had perhaps succumbed to the heat, or to a weak heart, though, as Miss Marple well knew, the lady was not known to be unwell. Sir Lawrence, dazed, clung to that explanation, murmuring, "Yes, the heat, of course. Poor Amelia." But Miss Marple, her clear blue eyes observing every detail, the faint discoloration about the lips, the overturned glass of lemonade near the bench, the peculiar stillness in Charlotte Denham's gaze, was not so easily satisfied. She felt, with the quiet certainty of instinct, sharpened by long years of observation, that this was no simple faint, no tragic collapse. Lady Amelia Fenton had not died by chance. Death had come into the garden, and Miss Marple, though outwardly composed and deferential, resolved that she must discover why. The aftermath of Lady Amelia's sudden death unfolded with a curious mixture of confusion and restraint. The servants, accustomed to the strict decorum of a country house, hovered at a distance, whispering in anxious tones. Guests spoke in subdued voices, as though afraid to disturb the still air of the garden, which only an hour earlier had been filled with laughter. Sir Lawrence Fenton, his complexion grey and his military bearing crumpled, stood rooted to the spot, muttering half-formed sentences. Dr. Latham, after covering the body respectfully with a shawl fetched by one of the maids, drew him aside in quiet consultation. It may be, Miss Marple overheard, for she had an unassuming way of being near at hand, a heart failure. Sir Lawrence, such things come swiftly, without warning. Sir Lawrence, clutching at the suggestion like a drowning man at driftwood, nodded. Yes, of course. The heat, the excitement of the day. Amelia was always delicate, but Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed upon the upturned glass on the grass beside the bench. A glass of lemonade untouched, save for a sip or two, the pale liquid glinting faintly in the sunlight. She bent ever so slightly, retrieving her dropped knitting, which afforded her the chance to glance closer. No wasp floated upon the surface, nor any other telltale intruder. The lemon slice looked quite innocent, and yet her instincts whispered otherwise. It was Dr. Latham who advised that the authorities must be informed, however reluctantly. The words seemed to strike Sir Lawrence like a blow. His eyes, watery with shock, flashed with irritation. "Surely that isn't necessary, Doctor. My wife was not a young woman, you know. Such things, these natural tragedies occurred." But the doctor's tone remained firm, if gentle. "You must understand, it is procedure. There will be questions asked. Better to invite an inquiry than to appear to avoid one." The solicitor, Mr. Miles, who had hovered in the background like a raven awaiting carrion, now stepped forward. "Dr. Latham is quite correct, Sir Lawrence. The law requires it. I shall, if you wish, make the necessary telephone call to the constabulary." His voice was precise, his eyes keenly watchful. And so, within the hour, Inspector Graves of the county police arrived at Greystone Manor. He was a tall man of middle years, with a careful manner and the kind of expression that revealed little of his thoughts. He spoke first with Dr. Latham, then with Sir Lawrence, and finally addressed the assembled guests beneath the pergola. "I regret, ladies and gentlemen, that I must ask you all to remain here at the house for the present. Lady Amelia's passing cannot, at this stage, be assumed to be natural, until further inquiries are made. It must be regarded as a matter requiring official attention. There was a murmur at this pronouncement. Miss Denham gave another of her little gasps, though this time it seemed rather calculated. Edward Grant exclaimed loudly about a dreadful business, and demanded to know how long he might be detained, for he had urgent letters awaiting his signature. Geoffrey Miles merely adjusted his spectacles, and looked quietly satisfied, as though the day had unfolded precisely as he had expected. Miss Marple sat silently, her knitting once again in hand, though the needles barely clicked. She had already noted Inspector Graves's careful eyes falling upon the glass of lemonade, which a constable had bagged and carried away. She observed the way his gaze lingered upon Sir Lawrence's strained countenance, and then upon Miss Denham's restless movements. The inspector was thorough, she judged, yet there were things he might not see, things too delicate, too shaded by the subtleties of human nature. That, Miss Marple knew from long experience, was where she might be of use. When the guests were at last permitted to move indoors, the atmosphere shifted from shocked confusion to something tauter, more private. In the drawing-room, voices lowered further, glances sharpened. Death had entered Greystone, and with it, suspicion. Miss Marple, settling quietly with her teacup, began to listen. She always listened. Edward Grant, sprawling in an armchair, was the first to break the silence. Dashed bad business, this. The poor lady, though, between ourselves, she was never particularly strong. Still, it casts a shadow over what ought to have been a delightful gathering. I suppose there'll be endless questions. Always is, in these cases. Charlotte Denham, perched on the sofa's edge, gave a brittle laugh. "Oh, how dreadful you are, Edward, to speak so. My cousin was kindness itself. She had not a single enemy in the world." Miss Marple's needles clicked once. Not a single enemy. It was the sort of remark that invited contradiction, though none offered it aloud. Geoffrey Miles cleared his throat. Lady Amelia was indeed much beloved. Still, one must recognize that such households as Greystone are never free from, how shall I put it, domestic strains, estates, properties, finances. Such matters create tension, even among the most loving of families. Sir Lawrence, seated stiffly by the fireplace, shot him a look of dislike. "I will not hear such talk. My wife is barely gone." But Miles only inclined his head, unmoved. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, reflected inwardly. Domestic strains, yes, that, she thought, was most perceptive, for she had already discerned beneath Lady Amelia's graceful manner a certain weariness, a tension in her eyes when her husband spoke too sharply, and an air of resigned patience when Miss Denham laughed too freely. Yes, there were currents here, as subtle and twisting as the roots beneath the rose bushes. That evening, after the inspector had withdrawn and Sir Lawrence had retired early in grief, Miss Marple found herself seated by a small fire in her guest chamber. Sylvia Harcourt, her hostess, tapped gently at the door, bringing in a tray of warm milk. "My dear Jane," Sylvia whispered, "what an awful business. I feel I must apologize for subjecting you to such a dreadful shock." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "Life is full of shocks, is it not? Though I must say, I cannot help but feel that Lady Amelia's death was untimely." Sylvia sighed. She was so young still, poor thing, and yet, Jane here she hesitated. "I cannot pretend I am altogether surprised. There were whispers, you know, tensions between her and Sir Lawrence. He is not the easiest of men. And then there was Charlotte." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "there was Charlotte." In the days that followed, the inquiry deepened. Inspector Graves returned to Greystone, conducting interviews with each guest and member of staff. Miss Marple, though not officially consulted, contrived to be often in earshot, or else to converse in her own gentle way with the housemaids, the gardener, even the cook. People talked to Miss Marple as they would to a kindly aunt, forgetting that her mild blue eyes missed nothing. From the gardener, she learned that Lady Amelia had taken to walking alone in the rose garden in recent weeks, lingering sometimes for hours, and that she often appeared troubled. From the cook, she heard of Lady Amelia's particular preference for lemonade over wine, so refreshing. Madam, though she was always careful where it came from the parlour maid, she gathered that Charlotte Denham and Lady Amelia had quarrelled once, late at night, over something not quite overheard, and from her own quiet observations, Miss Marple noted the way Geoffrey Miles's sharp gaze seemed always to linger on Sir Lawrence, as though watching for a crack in his armour. She saw too that Edward Grant, for all his hearty manners, grew pale whenever Inspector Graves mentioned finances, inheritance, or estates. It was enough to tell her one thing with certainty. Lady Amelia had not died by chance. She had died because someone, within this very house, had wished her gone. The precise why and how remained hidden, like weeds beneath a bed of roses. But Miss Marple, with patience and quiet determination, began to trace the threads. She knew, as surely as she knew the habits of every villager in St. Mary Mead, that the truth of human nature would reveal itself if only one looked closely enough, and Jane Marple always looked closely. The coroner's preliminary report, read aloud in the presence of Inspector Graves and Sir Lawrence, confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected all along. Lady Amelia had not died of natural causes. There were traces of digitalis in her system, a heart medicine, powerful and potentially deadly when administered in excess. Inspector Graves, grave indeed, wasted no time. This, Sir Lawrence, is no accident. Someone, with knowledge and intent, administered poison to Lady Amelia. The words settled over Greystone like a thundercloud, for though death had already cast its shadow, murder was a darker, more terrible presence. Sir Lawrence swore loudly, his voice ringing with outrage. Murder? In my own garden? Impossible. Amelia was loved by all. Who would commit such a crime? But even as he spoke, Miss Marple noticed the darting glances among the assembled company, the stiffened shoulders, the tightening of lips. Love, she thought, is not always what it seems. The inspector began his inquiries in earnest, summoning each guest for a private interview in the library. Miss Marple, with her customary tact, contrived to speak with them later, over tea or in the drawing-room, drawing out details the inspector might not hear. Charlotte Denham was the first to attract suspicion. Her grief was dramatic as one moment, laughter the next. My poor cousin, she declared. She was too good for this dreary world. If only she had listened to me, she might have been happy. Happy? Miss Marple inquired gently, as she wound her wool into a tidy ball. Charlotte gave a sharp little smile. Oh, my dear Miss Marple, surely you noticed. Amelia was desperately unhappy with Sir Lawrence. He treated her like one of his soldiers, barking orders, never a kind word. She was stifled here, positively stifled. I often told her she ought to leave him. She could have had a life of her own. A life of her own, Miss Marple repeated softly. And was that her wish? Charlotte shrugged, her earrings jingling. She hadn't the courage, but she was thinking of it. I know. And had she done so, well, there would have been a scandal, of course. Estates divided, reputations ruined. Sir Lawrence would have been furious. There it was. Then, a suggestion of motive. A wife seeking independence. A husband determined to prevent disgrace. But Miss Marple was not yet convinced. Charlotte, she reflected, was not merely indiscreet. She was also ambitious. Too ambitious, perhaps. Edward Grant, the industrialist, was another puzzle. He affected a joviality that rang hollow in Miss Marple's ears. Over a particularly strong whisky after dinner, he confided to Inspector Graves, loudly enough, that Miss Marple from her quiet corner could hear dashed shame. All this, but between ourselves, Amelia was a very wealthy woman, was she not? Money of her own. I dare say there'll be some considerable fortune to account for now, and you would know of that, Mr. Grant. The inspector asked coolly. Grant flushed, waving a hand. Only what one hears. Of course, I've a head for figures. Rumor had it she was the real source of the Fenton comforts. Old army pension doesn't stretch to a place like this, eh? He chuckled, though no one else did. Later, when the inspector had left the room, Miss Marple approached him quietly. You knew Lady Amelia well? Hardly at all, he said, surprised. Charming woman, certainly, but I'd only met her once or twice before today. Why do you ask? Because you speak of her affairs with some confidence. Miss Marple replied mildly, her knitting needles flashing. Grant laughed, though uneasily. I take an interest in such matters, Miss Marple. Old habit from business. Money makes the world go round, you know. Yes, thought Miss Marple. And sometimes, money makes it stop. Geoffrey Miles, the solicitor, was cooler, more precise. When Miss Marple engaged him in conversation about roses, he steered it deftly to wills and inheritance. A sad case, he said, polishing his spectacles. Lady Amelia, poor soul, had a generous heart. Too generous, some might say. She often wished to make provisions for charities, for friends. Sir Lawrence, however, opposed it. He believed the estate must remain intact. I myself advised her that she could, if she wished, make a will independent of her husband's interests. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly. And did she? Miles smiled thinly. "That, Miss Marple, is not a matter I may disclose at present, but I will say this. Wherever there is money, there is motive, and Lady Amelia's fortune was not inconsiderable. Dr. Harold Latham was, outwardly, above suspicion, kindly, attentive, respected by all. Yet Miss Marple, who knew human weakness better than most, did not dismiss him so easily. I cannot account for it," he told the inspector, shaking his head. "She had no prescription for I should have known if she required it. Such a dose must have been deliberate. Could it have been self-administered?" Miss Marple asked gently when she found herself beside him later in the garden. "Suicide?" Dr. Latham looked shocked. No. Lady Amelia was fragile, yes, but not despairing, and even if she had wished such a thing, she could not have obtained the medicine without my knowledge, unless, Miss Marple observed, someone with access to such medicines gave it to her. Dr. Latham frowned. "You mean one of my staff?" "Impossible. They are loyal, trustworthy people. Besides, the preparation would require careful dosage. It is not something an amateur would know." Miss Marple merely nodded, though inwardly she noted that doctors, too, were sometimes careless with their cupboards. Suspicions circled like a flock of crows. Sir Lawrence, brooding in his study, became more irritable by the day. He dismissed inquiries brusquely, railed at the inspector for his interference, and snapped at servants who lingered near. Yet he also showed signs of grief, his eyes red-rimmed, his posture slumped. A guilty conscience, or a grieving husband? Miss Marple pondered the question, and Charlotte Denham, once the life of the party, grew more restless. Miss Marple happened upon her in the rose garden one evening, pacing furiously, muttering under her breath. She started when she saw the old lady, forcing a smile. "Beautiful roses, aren't they, Miss Marple? Amelia loved them so." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "but some roses have thorns, do they not?" Charlotte's smile faltered. It was 2 days after the death that another event cast the household into fresh turmoil. A maid, dusting in Lady Amelia's boudoir, discovered a letter hidden in a writing desk. It was addressed to "My dearest Charlotte." Inspector Graves read it aloud, his voice neutral. It was a letter from Lady Amelia to her cousin, speaking of unhappiness, of feeling trapped, and of considering leaving Greystone. "I cannot endure much longer," she had written. "Sir Lawrence does not understand me. Sometimes I feel as though I am a bird in a cage. If only I had your courage, Charlotte. You always tell me to break free. Perhaps, one day soon, I shall." The implications were clear. Lady Amelia had been contemplating escape. Sir Lawrence's pride and position would have been destroyed by scandal. Strong motive there, Inspector Graves observed grimly. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "Strong, perhaps, but too obvious. Life rarely presented itself in such straight lines." Another clue surfaced when Mr. Miles, with a certain relish, informed the inspector that Lady Amelia had indeed made a will leaving a considerable sum not to her husband, but to her cousin Charlotte. "Good heavens!" cried Edward Grant. "To Charlotte? Why, that changes everything." "Yes," the inspector agreed. "It does." Charlotte confronted, flared up. "It was Amelia's idea, not mine. She wanted me to be provided for. Should I not marry? I never asked for it." Yet her protestations only deepened suspicion. Sir Lawrence stormed. Edward Grant blustered. Dr. Latham frowned. Geoffrey Miles looked smug, and Miss Marple, quietly knitting, saw how the threads tangled that evening. Miss Marple sat by the window of her guest chamber, the last light fading over the garden. She thought of Lady Amelia's pale face, the lemonade glass, the discoloured lips. She thought of digitalis, of how it might be obtained, and who might know its effects. She thought, too, of Charlotte's ambition, of Grant's greed, of Miles's precision, of Sir Lawrence's pride. Each had a reason, each had an opportunity, and yet, she felt, the truth lay not in the obvious. The letter, the will, the quarrels, they were too neatly placed, like rose petals scattered on a path. Real life was never so convenient. No, the truth, she felt, was hidden beneath the surface, and soon, very soon, it would reveal itself. For human nature, Miss Marple knew, could never keep a secret for long. The atmosphere at Greystone Manor grew steadily more oppressive with each passing day. The inspector's inquiries had yielded only contradictions and resentments. The guests and household alike felt the strain of suspicion. Meals were stiff, conversations guarded, laughter forced. It was as though the roses themselves had sensed corruption. Their blooms heavy and overripe, their scent cloying. Miss Marple, however, remained serenely composed. She knitted by the fire, took her quiet walks through the garden, and listened, always listened, for she knew that truth, like a weed, eventually pushed through the soil no matter how carefully it was concealed. Her opportunity came one afternoon when she accompanied Sylvia Harcourt into the village. While Sylvia purchased sewing silks, Miss Marple lingered near the apothecary's shop. Inside, she recognized the young assistant who often attended Dr. Latham. She slipped in, smiling sweetly. "I hope you can help me," she said, setting her handbag on the counter. "I am in need of a mild tonic for fatigue. My doctor in St. Mary Mead always recommended something with gentian." The assistant, eager to oblige, fetched a small bottle. Miss Marple lowered her voice conspiratorially. "You keep all manner of things here, don't you? Even the stronger medicines?" "Oh yes, madam," the assistant replied proudly. "Digitalis, morphia, all kept most securely, of course. Dr. Latham oversees the keys himself, and no one else has access." Miss Marple asked, her tone one of harmless curiosity. The young man hesitated. "Well, sometimes Dr. Latham entrusts me to prepare doses, and Miss Denham, Lady Amelia's cousin, she once came in with a note requesting heart drops for her cousin. I only gave her a very small supply, of course. She said Dr. Latham had advised it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "How very conscientious of you, and how fortunate Lady Amelia had such attentive relations." She left the shop with her tonic, her mind busily knitting threads together. Charlotte Denham, with Digitalis in her possession. That was significant. But significant in what way? Too obvious a trail, perhaps. Too convenient. That evening, she joined Inspector Graves in the drawing-room. He had grown weary with frustration. "Every path I take leads to Charlotte Denham," he said heavily. "She had the will, she had the means, and she had opportunity." But he broke off, shaking his head. "Something doesn't fit. She is reckless, yes, but not secretive enough. Murder requires cunning." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You are quite right, Inspector. Murder does require cunning, but one must remember cunning often disguises itself in the appearance of simplicity." He looked at her shrewdly. "You have some notion, Miss Marple." "I have a suspicion," she admitted, "but suspicions must be proved or disproved. Tell me, Inspector, was the glass of lemonade tested for fingerprints?" "It was," he replied. "Lady Amelia's, of course, and interestingly, Sir Lawrence's." "None other." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "that is most enlightening." The next day, Miss Marple took a turn about the garden with Sir Lawrence himself. He had grown more haggard since his wife's death, his step heavy, his voice strained. "They are determined to make a criminal out of Charlotte," he muttered bitterly, "and perhaps she deserves it. She was always filling Amelia's head with nonsense. But murder, no, I cannot believe it. Grief is a terrible burden," Miss Marple said gently. "It clouds the mind. But tell me, Sir Lawrence, was Lady Amelia truly so unhappy?" He stiffened. "She was delicate. She fancied herself misunderstood. But she was my wife. I cared for her as best I knew how." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Sometimes, Sir Lawrence, those who care most sternly convince themselves they act from love. But love must be gentle, or it becomes tyranny." He flushed, but said nothing more. It was later that evening, as she sat in her chamber, that the final piece of the puzzle slipped into place. She had been thinking of Charlotte's letter, Amelia's will, Grant's gossip, Miles's legal maneuvering, and the doctor's medicines. All pointed to Charlotte neatly, almost as though the evidence had been arranged for discovery. And then she recalled something quite simple. The glass, the fingerprints upon it were only Amelia's and her husband's. If Charlotte had slipped poison into the drink, surely her prints or at least the smudge of another's might have been present. Yet they were not, which meant Amelia had not poured her own lemonade. Sir Lawrence had done it for her. It was a small act, chivalrous on the surface, yet damning beneath, for only one who placed the glass in her hand could be certain the poison reached her. Lips. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. The picture was complete. Lady Amelia, weary and restless, had contemplated escape. Sir Lawrence, proud and rigid, could not bear the disgrace, and so he had contrived to silence her gently, permanently under the very roses he prized. But he had erred. He had left a tidier trail toward Charlotte, too eager to shift suspicion from himself, and in doing so, he had revealed the truth. The following morning, Miss Marple requested a private word with Inspector Graves. He listened intently as she laid out her reasoning, his expression shifting from doubt to comprehension, and finally to grim resolve. "You are certain?" he asked at last. "As certain as one can be," Miss Marple replied. Sir Lawrence poured the lemonade. "His prints are the only ones present besides Lady Amelia's. He had the strongest motive to preserve his reputation, his estate, his pride, and he sought to divert suspicion by allowing Charlotte to appear reckless with Digitalis. It was clever, but not quite clever enough." The inspector exhaled slowly. "I must tread carefully. The law requires proof. But what you say, yes, it fits, and I shall obtain the final piece." Together, they contrived a plan. The inspector would confront Sir Lawrence with the evidence, while Miss Marple would be present, ostensibly, as a sympathetic companion. Often, she knew, guilt revealed itself not under direct accusation, but under the weight of silence. The confrontation came that afternoon in the library. Sir Lawrence stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set. Inspector Graves laid out the facts: the poison, the glass, the prints, the motive. For a long moment, Sir Lawrence said nothing. His face, stern and weathered, betrayed no emotion. But Miss Marple, watching closely, saw the twitch of his mouth, the flicker in his eyes. At last he spoke, his voice low, harsh. "You know nothing of it. Amelia was weak. She would have left me. Do you understand? She would have destroyed everything I built. I could not allow it. A man has his duty to his name, to his honor, to his estate. She was too fragile for this life." His words, stripped of pretense, hung in the air like smoke. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Then you admit asterisk," but Miss Marple raised a hand. Her voice, quiet but firm, filled the room. "No, Sir Lawrence, you do not speak of duty. You speak of pride. Amelia was not weak. She was weary of being caged. You killed her because you could not bear to see her free." For the first time, Sir Lawrence faltered. His shoulders sagged, his eyes closed. When he opened them again, the defiance was gone. "Yes," he whispered, "I could not bear it." And thus the truth was laid bare. Sir Lawrence Fenton, soldier, landowner, husband, had poisoned his wife beneath the roses of Greystone, not for love, nor even hatred, but for pride. But Miss Marple, leaving the library, felt the evening air cool upon her face. The garden lay before her, its blooms heavy with fragrance. Beauty and death, side by side. She sighed softly, her heart touched with sorrow. Human nature, she thought, is ever the same. Pride, vanity, greed, ambition, these are the poisons that linger long after the flowers fade. But at least for Lady Amelia, there was now justice. Asterisk, the confession once spoken could not be recalled. Sir Lawrence Fenton stood rigid by the mantelpiece, as though the words had been dragged from him against his will. Inspector Graves wasted no time. He called in his sergeant, placed the man formally under arrest, and recited the charge of murder. But the moment lacked triumph. Instead, there was a stillness, as though the great house itself mourned. Sir Lawrence offered no resistance. He simply bowed his head, a proud figure crumbling under invisible weight. Word of the arrest spread swiftly through Greystone Manor. The household staff whispered in corridors. The guests gathered in clusters, their faces pale with shock. That Sir Lawrence, the master of the estate, so stern and upright, should be guilty of such a crime, seemed unthinkable. And yet the truth lay plain before them. Charlotte Denham, when told, stared in disbelief. "Lawrence," she gasped, "but he loved Amelia. For all his faults, I never doubted that." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Love, my dear, can take many forms. Some nourish, others destroy. Sir Lawrence's love was that of possession, not freedom. It was pride, dressed as devotion." Charlotte pressed a hand to her brow, her voice trembling. "And I thought they suspected me." "They were meant to," Miss Marple replied softly. "That was his cleverness. You were reckless, outspoken, fond of quarrel, easy to paint as a villain, but villains rarely fit so neatly into the frame. I have learned to distrust convenient answers." That evening, Inspector Graves requested that Miss Marple address the assembled guests. Many had questions, suspicions, lingering doubts, and so, in the drawing-room, she set aside her knitting and spoke with her customary quiet authority. Lady Amelia's death appeared. At first glance, a tragedy of chance. She began, a weak heart, a sudden collapse. But the presence of poison digitalis in excess transformed sorrow into suspicion, and suspicion fell most readily upon Miss Denham, whose quarrels with Lady Amelia were no secret, and who had, indeed, once obtained such medicine from the apothecary, yet suspicion, when too easily placed, is often a mask. The true culprit had arranged matters so that Miss Denham's recklessness would serve as a perfect distraction. Evidence was laid like breadcrumbs, visible, tempting, but there was one detail that betrayed the hand behind the crime. The glass of lemonade, you see, only 2 sets of fingerprints were present, Lady Amelia's and Sir Lawrence's. No trace of Miss Denham, nor anyone else's. If she had tampered with the drink, there would surely have been some mark. Instead, it was Sir Lawrence himself who poured it, ensuring the fatal draught reached his wife. She paused, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle. Faces around her showed dawning comprehension, horror, and pity. As to motive, she continued quietly, it was not wealth alone, nor jealousy, nor even anger. It was pride. Lady Amelia had spoken, perhaps, not aloud, but in her heart, of leaving. To Sir Lawrence, that would have been unbearable. Better, in his mind, to silence her than to face the disgrace of abandonment. He mistook possession for love, control for care, and so he poisoned her. The room fell silent. Miles Renwick looked down, his lips pressed tight. Dr. Latham rubbed his brow in shame at not having perceived the danger sooner. Sylvia Harcourt wept softly into her handkerchief. Even Grant, the bitter secretary, seemed subdued, muttering, "I never thought, never him." Charlotte Denham, after a long silence, rose and crossed the room. "Then Amelia died because she longed for freedom," she said bitterly. "Freedom denied her in life, denied her in death. But at least the truth is known." She turned to Miss Marple, her voice steadier. "You have done what none of us could." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "Truth, my dear, is a stubborn plant. However deeply buried, it will grow." The following days brought grim consequences. Sir Lawrence, under guard, was taken to London for trial. The newspapers seized upon the scandal. Aristocrat poisonous society. Marriage ends in murder. The once proud name of Fenton became a byword for disgrace. At Greystone, life struggled to return to rhythm. Meals were quieter, the gardens less tended, the atmosphere subdued. Yet there was also, curiously, a lightness, as though the house itself exhaled after long suffocation. Inspector Graves, preparing to depart, sought Miss Marple's counsel one last time. "You have an extraordinary gift," he said frankly. "I spent days chasing quarrels, wills, and alibis, while you saw at once what truly mattered." Miss Marple smiled. "It is not extraordinary, Inspector. It is merely human nature. In every village, every home, one sees the same patterns. Pride disguised as duty, envy cloaked as affection, malice hidden under civility. Murder is but an extreme expression of ordinary vices." Graves shook his head with a wry smile. "You make it sound so simple, yet it eluded me, because you look for villains," Miss Marple said gently. "I look for people, and people are never what they seem." On the day of her departure, Miss Marple walked once more through the rose garden. The blooms were beginning to fade, petals strewn across the paths. She paused before the very bush beneath which Lady Amelia had fallen. There was sadness in her eyes, but not despair. "Poor child," she murmured, "you longed for life, for freedom. At least you are free now." Sylvia Harcourt, who had come to bid her farewell, heard the words, and shivered. "Do you think such tragedies ever end, Miss Marple, or do they happen again and again?" Miss Marple laid a hand upon her arm. "They do happen again, my dear, for as long as there is pride, vanity, and fear, there will be tragedy. But so long as there is kindness, patience, and truth, there will also be hope. One must tend to the good as one tends a garden, even knowing weeds will come." Sylvia's eyes filled with tears. "You give me courage, Miss Marple." "Not courage, child, only perspective." The train that carried Miss Marple back toward St. Mary Mead rattled through green fields and quiet villages. She sat by the window, her knitting upon her lap, reflecting as she always did upon the case just past. Lady Amelia fragile, yearning, crushed beneath her husband's pride. Sir Lawrence so certain of his righteousness, undone by the very love he professed. Charlotte, Miles, Sylvia, Grant, all entangled, each with motives and secrets, yet innocent of the final deed. It was a story as old as time, written again in the soil of Greystone, the clash between freedom and control, love and pride, life and death, and she, Jane Marple, had merely been there to read it. She drew a thread of wool through her needles and smiled faintly, for beyond tragedy lay the simple consolations: a quiet garden, a cup of tea, the comfort of order restored. Back in St. Mary Mead, her neighbours gathered eagerly to hear of her journey. They exclaimed, they gossiped, they marvelled at her role in unmasking a murderer. Miss Marple, as always, downplayed her involvement. It was nothing remarkable, she said modestly. One notices little things, that is all. Human nature is the same everywhere, whether in a great house or a village lane, and once one recognizes it, the truth becomes clear. Her friends nodded, half understanding, half admiring, and Miss Marple returned to her roses, her knitting, her gentle routines. But within her mind she carried the memory of Greystone, of Lady Amelia's sad eyes, of pride that poisoned love. She carried it not with bitterness, but with the quiet conviction that, in observing, in understanding, one might prevent her at least reveal the darkness that lurks beneath human hearts. And so ended the mystery of death in the garden. The roses of Greystone would bloom again, their beauty undiminished, but for those who had dwelt there, their fragrance would forever carry the memory of one who had perished among them, and of the gentle spinster who had uncovered the truth. For Miss Marple, it was but one story among many another proof of what she had always known, that beneath every quiet surface lies a world of secrets, and that justice, however delayed, may yet prevail.